It's time for a build on Wizard. It's been a while since I played a caster class. Ever since my original video on Cleric, I haven't touched casters since then. I was going to do a Barbarian video, but I decided to go Wizard instead, so here we are. This video is going to teach you how to play Wizard, as well as give you the spells and perks and essentially a build guide for both solo and group play. This build guide is going to be a bit different than the previous ones I've made. I'm going to walk you through two builds here, and these builds are both viable in both solo and group play. However, the two builds themselves play distinctly differently, so I'm going to be referring to these two builds as a no ignite build and an ignite build. The difference being that the first build will focus on just spellcasting and nothing to do with the ignite spell, whereas the second build will focus on the ignite spell and using that. So without further ado, let's get into it. For skills, the two skills we'll be taking are Meditation and Spell Memory. Meditation will allow us to restore spells, and Spell Memory will allow us to cast spells. Starting with the no ignite build. The no ignite build will have similar spells to the ignite build, minus one spell in particular, ignite. The spells we'll be taking are Haste, Invisibility, Magic Missile, Zap, and Fireball, or Chain Lightning, depending on your preference. Now, I will say that as of recording this, recently, Fireball has been nerfed, dropping the splash damage from 20 to 10. This is a very substantial nerf to Fireball, as previously if you missed with the Fireball but still hit the ground near a target, you would still get 20 points of damage, but now it's only 10. So keep that in mind when deciding between Fireball or Chain Lightning. As for the casting focus that we will use for this build, we'll be using Spellbook. Now, I cannot stress this enough. Use Spellbook. Do not use a staff, do not use a sword to cast, and don't use a crystal ball for this one. Use a Spellbook. Spellbook has the highest movement speed out of any of the casting sources. And to be perfectly honest, movement is everything on Wizard. Wizard is a movement-based class, probably the biggest movement-based class. So, make sure to pick up a spellbook. If the alchemist is selling low-level spellbooks infinitely, buy a bunch of them and fill up your stash with them. That way you always have them. So now let's move on to the ignite build. So, for the ignite build, the spells we'll be taking are Haste, Invisibility, Magic Missile, Ignite, and Fireball. Similar to the no ignite build, we are taking Haste, Invisibility, and Magic Missile, and Fireball, though I would recommend sticking with Fireball and not swapping to Chain Lightning for this one. And then Ignite. Now the Ignite spell is what separates this apart from the previous build, and that's because the Ignite spell will allow you to wreathe your melee weapon or somebody else's melee weapon in flames. This will cause your melee weapons to do a lot more damage than they were doing before, and for the wizard who can wield a dagger, this turns them almost into a rogue, if not better than a rogue. And this is why for the casting focus on this build, we're going Crystal Ball and Dagger. No spellbook this time, we're going Crystal Ball and Dagger because the Crystal Ball can be wielded at the same time as a dagger, meaning you can cast spells and also stab simultaneously. This will allow for a very aggressive spell casting as well as always having the dagger ready to stab targets. Now, I'll get into how to play both of these builds in a moment, but first let's talk about what perks and gear you should be looking at. So for the perks are the same on both of these builds. You're going to want to take Quick Chant so you can cast your spells faster. You'll want to take Arcane Mastery for increased damage. You'll also want to take Sage, and the reason we're taking Sage is because when we increase our knowledge stat, our casting speed goes up. You won't need extra knowledge to hold any of the spells that we're using in this build. At base, you can already hold all the spells. We merely want more knowledge so that we cast quicker. And finally, we take Fire Mastery, or Mana Surge if you're using Chain Lightning. But specifically if you're doing the Ignite spell, take Fire Mastery, because Fire Mastery will transfer to both your Ignite and your Fireball. If you are not using Ignite, and you are using Chain Lightning, then I would take Mana Surge. As far as your spellcasting focus, that will depend on which of the two builds you're doing. Again, if you're not using Ignite, take Spellbook, and if you are igniting, then take Crystal Ball and Dagger. But aside from that, we're going to want potions, specifically potions of protection and potions of healing. If I were you, I'd always use a potion of protection at the start of fights if you have one. And as far as potions of healing go, and also bandages, which we would also like to take here, healing in general for the wizard is very important, as you don't have a lot of hit points. You are very much a glass cannon. That being said, healing potions and bandages go a long way for a wizard. You only have a 75-point health pool, so bandages and healing potions can really make the difference between your health bar being low or high. Now, let's talk about stats. The two stats you're going to want to target are Will and Knowledge. Will allow your spells to do more damage, and Knowledge will increase the speed at which you cast those spells. These two things are very important because, as a wizard, that is all we're doing, is doing spell damage and casting the spells to do the damage. So, Will and Knowledge are fundamental to increasing our effectiveness. Okay, so now that we've covered the two builds, let's move on to talking about how to play Wizard. So, as far as PvE goes, when we're talking about how to play Wizard, we're essentially talking about Magic Missile. And the reason we take Magic Missile on both of the builds is not just because it's an effective spell in PvP, which it is, but because Magic Missile is your main source of damage for PvE. Magic Missile is your bread and butter when it comes to killing mobs. And like the Ranger, abusing your surroundings to get up high is very important. As a wizard, it's very key that we do not take damage, as our health pool is very small. So be sure to parkour onto objects and use your Magic Missile while standing on top of them. This makes mowing down PvE mobs much easier and much safer. When you're working on clearing mobs in PvE, anytime you have a break, I would always use your meditation. Constantly be using meditation to get spells back. Don't wait until you think you hear players and then start meditating. Be meditating as often as you can. The only other thing I'll mention about PvE for the wizard is that if you need to use invisibility, use it. Invisibility will allow you to break aggro on mobs, and if there's a room you need to cross quickly and just get to the other door and open it, simply invis yourself while you're walking through the room. That way you don't draw as much aggro, at least not as quickly. Yes, you will lose invisibility when you go to open a door, but all of the mobs will have been close to resetting by then, and probably won't make it to you by the time you have the door open. And another thing for PvE, do not use your Fireball or Chain Lightning to clear mobs in PvE. Use Magic Missile and only Magic Missile to clear mobs. If you're using Ignite, then you can use Ignite on your weapon and start stabbing mobs to clear them more quickly. But if you're not using Ignite, then just use Magic Missile to clear mobs. I cannot stress enough that Fireball and Chain Lightning are not worth it. You could run into a PvP fight at any moment, and you don't want to have those spells on cooldown when you're in a PvP fight. Magic Missile is for clearing mobs and can be useful in PvP, but is your main source of mob clear. Now, speaking of PvP, let's move on to talking about PvP. Now, earlier I said that Wizard is a movement class, and I meant it. Wizard is very much a movement-based class. So I'm going to talk about the two builds separately here for PvP. Let's start with the no Ignite build. Now, we took Spellbook here as our casting focus for a reason. Wizard is a movement-based class, like I said. The Spellbook will allow us to move the quickest out of any of the spellcasting focuses. If you're alone in a PvP fight, ideally what you want to be doing is using Fireball whenever you have distance on targets, or Magic Missile if they're straight lining you. Here's the thing, Magic Missile is very good and does a lot of damage, but if the target is moving left or right and has the space to do so or is far away, it's going to be very difficult to land Magic Missile shots. Fireball is a bit easier, and if you miss with a Fireball, you can still do splash damage. And in regards to that, always be aiming towards the legs of your enemies in PvP, because you can still hit the legs, and if you hit your target then great and it does all the damage Fireball can do, but if you miss, you still get some of that splash damage and burn. So always aim for the legs. If the enemy players have taken a lot of damage, if you've hit them with a fireball or two, or have lit them up with some of your magic missiles, start spamming Zap on that player. Zap is a hit scan attack, so it's much easier to hit than the other two. Zap is very good for cleaning up weakened targets. If players start to get too close to you, you have haste and invisibility. If you have haste on yourself, you can outrun your enemies. Use haste to create distance, and weave invisibility in there to confuse your enemies. Haste and invisibility are your way of creating distance and breaking up melee fights. As a wizard, we don't want to be caught in melee. We'd much prefer to be 20 meters away shooting fireballs, magic missiles, and zaps. So, haste and invisibility is your toolkit to get out of melee. One other thing I will say in regards to invisibility, something to note about invisibility is because it breaks your aggro on mobs, it's a good tool for if PvE mobs are dragged into a PvP fight, which is very common. If you find yourself being the one targeted by the PvE mobs while trying to fight other players, cast invisibility. This will break your aggro on the mobs and cause the mobs to attack the players who are attacking you. This can be a very good tool to use the mobs as minions or extra players to fight your enemies. Now for the Ignite build. For the Ignite build, you do play a bit differently than you would without it. So here we're using the Crystal Ball and Dagger, and the idea is we want to get close to our enemies and stab them with a fiery dagger. The Ignite build is pretty simple. If your enemies are at range, use Fireball to deal damage. When you feel it's time to rush your enemies, or your enemies are getting close to you anyways, simply do this. Cast Haste on yourself, cast Ignite on yourself, and then cast Invisibility on yourself. Now close the distance. And that's essentially it. When you're hasted and invisible and have Ignite on your blade, you can feel free to close the distance very quickly and without them knowing exactly where you'll be when you lose invisibility. That way you can use this as a gap closer. Once you're close, simply just repeatedly stab them with your ignited dagger. This does a lot of damage, trust me. If you've seen how scary it is when a rogue gets up in your face, a wizard with an ignited dagger is just as, if not more, terrifying. Alright, so those are the two builds. I'll put them up on the screen now. Feel free to apply these to your wizard. Like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.